Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast, a competitor's guide to mental health and mastery. My name is Paul Clean. I've known sports and training my entire life, but it wasn't until I worked on my mind that I finally started achieving what I believed I was capable of. When I combined mindful and spiritual practices to my already competitive demeanor, I gained a new level of clarity in life and traded my career at Amazon to start Down Dog Athletics. In this podcast, I interview top athletes and coaches to uncover the mindsets of top performers. You'll hear from doctors, authors, and experts in the health space as they break down how to take your mental health, physical health, and performance to the next level. And last but not least, you'll hear from me and my experiences and how I'm cultivating growth for myself and my clients, both mentally and physically. Let's go. What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast, Competitor's Guide to Mental Health and Mastery. I hope you guys enjoyed Monday's episode, the Mindful Muscle segment, new segment that I'm going to be adding. And it's reflective of a new direction. I won't even say a new direction, just an evolution of who I am and what I want to do as a coach, what I want to bring to this world and help you guys with. And that's mindfulness. Is all the things that I've taken from yoga, taken from coaches, taken from experiences that have caused me to spend a lot of time reflecting and growing. But then there's also gratitude and visualization and so many practices that you can do to improve your mental performance. And so there's going to be that side of it that we're going to talk a lot about, and a lot of the guests are going to be related to that. But then there's also the training piece and building muscle and becoming a more athletic version of yourself. When you look at yourself in the mirror, you want to look athletic. You want to train to be athletic. And what does that look like? And so the guests that we're going to have on, the conversations that I want to have, and the way that I want to help people is to do both those things, is to train the mind using mindfulness and mental performance, and to train the body, build more muscle, and be able to be more athletic. And that's what I want to help you do. I want to help you evolve into the greatest version of yourself using those two things as the catalyst. I'm going to have a few programs, actually just one program, but a few opportunities to join Mindful Muscle, the program that I'll be releasing probably in about mid-December. So keep an eye out for that. I'll be talking about it on the podcast in the future as well. But I want to get into today's guest. And Jeremiah Bair, someone that we had on earlier I think it was episode 4, one of the first guests that I had on. The guy is one of the smartest dudes in the country when it comes to training the body for aesthetics. And he's actually someone that I work with in building my own body. And so we're going to dive into the 6 principles that he has to building the most amount of muscle and really unveiling the body of your dreams. So here we go. Going to jump into that conversation right now. Hope you enjoy it. It was in the book. You didn't read the book. Right, it's kind of like the tree falling in the woods. Like, did it really? It didn't make a sound. Did it fall? And so let's just kind of talk about those and some either deeper principles or your approach with exercise selection, exercise execution, and how important that really is.
Yeah, for sure, man. So honestly, I have a whole system to this. It's a good bit different than your muscle and strength pyramids. But if you're cool with it, I can kind of just talk through.
Yeah, totally.
Hey, this is kind of the 6 steps, or these are the boxes that we tick for the system that we use. Are you cool with that? And we're recording already, yeah?
Yeah, 100%.
So, okay, perfect. So, in a nutshell, man, let's just kind of talk through. Okay, so we can systemize all this. Now, you kind of mentioned Cody. I know Cody McBroom, someone we both learned a lot from. I've really very much this is something I pulled from muscle and strength pyramids, Cody McBroom. I've learned a ton from Revive Stronger. So how I do things is a bit different than how Cody does things. Revive Stronger, Renaissance Periodization, and then kind of in one education, who just in your check-in today, those were 2 people that I linked up. Absolutely check out. But so first and foremost, we kind of have this system to make sure that we're doing everything properly to get results. So first and foremost, everything that we're doing, and we're started with training, of course, is built around consistency within your reps. And I know that's one of the biggest things we focused on when you first started, right? I was having you drop me form videos for everything, and I was talking through all right, dude, you need to make sure that you have a very consistent start and end point to each rep. When you're doing that dumbbell incline press, I want you to make sure that touches your shoulder at the bottom of each rep, and you're fully locking out your elbows at the top or whatever. I think that one thing, because very much when we're talking about things at this level, we're talking to people that have been training for at least a couple of years at this point, and they're kind of starting to spin their wheels past that point or want to see quicker progress. So typically these are individuals that understand okay, volume is important, and most of the time we get caught up in okay, I want to push the load more and more and more. I want to set PRs this week relative to last week. But the thing most people fail to realize is, let's use the example of a back squat because it's the easiest. If last week you squatted 225 for 8, and this week you squatted 225 for 9, but you don't have any like consistent start and end points, do you actually know that you set a PR, or were your reps just a little bit higher this week as opposed to last week? So like one of the first things I focus on with anyone I bring on is like, okay, for every single movement, I want you to identify these clear start and end points. That's really, as simple as that is, like that's one of the biggest difference makers for
Yeah.
most people. And like right away, people start making very quick gains.
But what you're talking about is someone who says, all right, I did 8 push-ups on the ground, and then I did 8 push-ups on an incline bench, and then I did 10. And it's like, well, yeah, you changed the
Right.
mechanics of it. So it's going to be easier because the angles aren't as deep and you're not getting to that like full range of motion.
But within the same movement, even this gives us like, the beauty of this is, okay, so we'll just call this point one. This is a consistent start and end points for each movement, or Steve Hall calls this terminal consistency. Again, like I can't take credit for most of this because most of this is like stuff I pulled from other people.
Right.
But terminal consistency within your reps is like the foundation that we're building everything else on, because that gives us like, okay, week to week, I know I added weight or I added load, and my reps, like my range of motion was exactly the same this week as it was last week. So therefore I know that I'm actually making progress. So that's one of the biggest things that we're going to focus on. From there, then we're diving into exercise selection when we're building on. And let me know if you want me to elaborate on any of this. I kind of just dived into this. So
Yeah, no, I mean, even just that right there, the fact that you have to have like apples to apples if you're going to measure PRs.
Okay. And that's again, like the foundation that we're building all this on, which is super simple, but it's just good execution, good form, right? Full range of motion that you can take a movement through safely. Now from there, then we're going to dive into exercise selection. So like, as you know, within your program, it's pretty simple. Like we're not doing anything that complex. Variations of squat, hinge, lunge, push, pull. But we're choosing movements that, one, the target muscle group that we want to grow is the rate limiter, right? So for example, like a high bar back squat, we want your quads to be the limiter there. So I'm going to cue you like, dude, I want you to make sure you're taking your knees through like, or you're achieving a good amount of knee flexion. A high bar movement, even though you could like lift more weight on maybe a low bar squat, we know like a lot more posterior is going to kick in there. Maybe your lower back's going to be a bit more of a limiter. So we very much want to ensure that this is the rate limiter. Or like I think we talked about on loaded carries, like I want you to start using straps, right? That we had that conversation, correct?
Yeah.
Because again, like we're doing this to help you get a strong core, not to bring your grip strength up. So if grip's the limiting factor, it's kind of a shit exercise for actually bringing up your core. And I know we just talked about this a bit before, but I think that's another big piece with people look at movements and like, okay, this is a squat movement pattern. Or even like, I think we had this conversation with goblet squats as well.
Yeah.
Like sissy squats bother your knees, I think it was, right? So, hey, let's plug in something else. And you mentioned like a goblet squat. So while a goblet squat is a squat pattern, we know most of the time, like I have you doing a squat because I want it to fatigue your quads close enough to failure that we're actually stimulating muscle growth.
Right.
But if you're plugging in, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and at that point, like to actually get the quads to failure, it's going to turn into either more of like a cardio workout or my grip strength's going to go. My biceps are going to go because I'm going to have to hold a kettlebell that's 100 pounds.
Or even like upper back for most people.
Yeah, upper back too.
So two, we're looking at what's the rate limiter for movements. Really, for most people, that's a huge one. Next, we're trying to choose mostly compound exercises. So Mental Henselman's has this term compoundedness, which basically means it works multiple joints and oftentimes multiple muscle groups at once. Now, of course, we work in some isolation exercises as well, but we're choosing mostly compound movements. Range of motion is another one that we focus on quite a bit, just because for most of our, so again, like let's look at a high bar back squat versus a box squat. Again, with the goal of you building your quads. All right, so we know that the quads role in your squat is going to be like knee flexion and extension, mostly knee extension, right? But that knee flexion, knee extension, that's going to be how we're stimulating your quads. We also know that the more range of motion we can get there, like the more knee flexion we can achieve, the more stimulus per rep you're going to get. So it would make much more sense for us to like, and you see a lot of people like load up a box squat and go super heavy on it, and while it likely is a good power movement, or like if you're trying to teach someone how to turn it into a more posterior dominant squat, for quad hypertrophy specifically, high bar back squat is going to make so much more sense because you can have so much more range of motion specific to like the joint we want the most movement at, for like, again, for your quads. So again, the knee joint here. So which is another thing when we're looking at like exercise selection, I think people often will overlook. Or even like if we're looking at like a floor press, where like of course there's applications for it, but still we could argue like for your chest, you're gonna need a much bigger stretch at the bottom of every single rep. Like you could just plug this in as a horizontal press, but we have to consider like, okay, how much range of motion are we really sacrificing here? Now again, like there's applications, shoulder issues, etc., but something to consider.
Wouldn't you
Next,
say that mobility and shoulder issues would be a rate limiter as well?
absolutely. And that's what, again, like, as you know, like all of this is so individualized. So by no means am I saying here like, hey, everyone should do a high bar back squat. Or like I would argue there's a lot of people that shouldn't do a high bar back squat. So of course, like you said, man, everyone's gonna have different rate limiters. Now, like you're a good example of someone who you don't have very many mobility rate limiters or things like that. So we can just plug in all these movements with like your biggest rate limiter, I would say, is the amount of equipment you have to work with. Like you move well, you're a strong dude, you don't have any glaring imbalances. So we can just plug in the movements that I think are the best fit for you in your anatomy, your biomechanics, and you'll crush. But no, that's a great point. Mobility is a good rate limiter as well. Next, we want some eccentric component, which is another one I think people fail to consider. We do know that the eccentric, or the negative portion of a lift, does create some muscle damage. So when it comes to hypertrophy, which again, this is different than if you're training for strength or for power, but for building muscle, we want movements that do have some eccentric. So for example, like one thing that's almost blasphemy is like talking about like barbell deadlifts. Like a conventional barbell deadlift, for most people, and this is going to tie into stimulus to fatigue ratio as well, which we'll touch on next. And again, man, stop me here at any point.
Yeah.
But
One question I want to jump in real quick, though. You were talking about eccentric. A lot of people throw around time under tension, and I feel like eccentric and isometric and time under tension, like there's variance and nuance between all that, right? You can't just get someone to isometric and have a ton of tension there and see the same growth that you would see with the eccentric, right?
absolutely. And there's so much, like that's getting very deep into like, hey, the studies on isometrics versus the studies on eccentrics. Basically, though, from what we seem to know, like specific to eccentrics, they don't seem like an eccentric hold doesn't seem to be very stimulative for hypertrophy. Whereas an eccentric, we know like most of the muscle damage in a movement comes from the eccentric component. And we do know like if we have our three mechanisms of hypertrophy, like we have mechanical tension, which of course is important. We have metabolic stress, and we have muscle damage, right? And it's not that mechanical tension is the most important factor, but still it does seem more and more that an eccentric component, and like, or you could even say like it's often termed like dynamic concentric and eccentric contractions, right? Are going to be the biggest components that we're chasing here. So one, it comes down to like, again, if we're looking at a conventional deadlift, all right, so if we look at, okay, what muscles are we trying to grow here? Likely it's going to be your glutes and hamstrings, right? Okay, so if we look at how most people deadlift, yeah, you can lift some heavy ass on the way up, but when you're lowering that weight, there's not really any eccentric component involved at all, right? Most people are just going to be dropping that weight very quickly. And at the bottom of that, you're not like getting a big stretch on your hamstrings. So range of motion is going to be a little bit shorter for most people as well. So if we're looking at it for like from a muscle building perspective, for the goal specific of building hamstrings or building glutes as well, for most people, a Romanian deadlift would be a better fit, right? And then the final argument of that is how much fatigue are we creating for the amount of stimulus that you're getting? So, and again, this varies a lot by individual. There are some people who like, man, a traditional deadlift absolutely smokes my hamstrings. And I think there's something to be said too for like how does it make you feel? Like,
Mhm.
do you feel like, are your hamstrings smoked after that? I know that's like the least scientific thing ever, but that's the reality of it too. We need to
I
take
ask
it.
that question all the time in person. I'm like, there's two things you're going to hear from me. Like, I want you to tell me if you're ever in pain, and I'm going to ask you every single set, like, where do you feel that? How does that feel? And a lot of times it's like, I feel it in the legs. And it's like, all right, we got to dive into this more. But it's like, if you don't feel it there, you odds are not working that specific muscle.
Yeah, yeah.
And that
And
was another question, real quick, I just wanted to touch on too, where how much of when we're doing something that is eccentric is in FRC, they call it eccentric neural grooving, right? And so that eccentric component is allowing the brain to, in a slower way, like recruit more motor neurons to basically like get stronger in the motor recruitment. Is there anything that you've seen with that in terms of like neurological, where you're basically able to like bring more fibers online?
I wish I could say I knew more about that, but I'm not
Okay.
sure.
Okay. No worries. Yeah, it's just, but it's like you think about like that eccentric. I love using that as a way to teach movement because you're doing it in a slowed down container.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I like that a lot as well. So from there, then we're talking about again, like how much fatigue to stimulate, like what's the stimulus to fatigue ratio of the movement. So again, like most people know, a barbell deadlift, you're going to be, and again, I'm not trying to shit on barbell deadlifts. This is again just like thinking through like applications specific to your goals. Most people are going to be smashed after that, right? So overall, the amount of volume they're going to do from that is low. The fatigue costs are high. The recovery costs are high, I should say. Whereas again, like a Romanian deadlift, you can take a bit lighter. You're going to have a lot less fatigue, but arguably you're going to have more stimulus from said movement. So again, when we're looking at movements, like looking at this stimulus to fatigue ratio, and again, often like range of motion is something that's very helpful to consider here. But again, that's the next piece that we're really looking at. And then of course we want it to be able to, we want the ability to overload movements over time, which is pretty simple. And most like, except for like right now, I know you're getting to the point where you're checking, you said you're maxing out the dumbbells, right? Like your gym doesn't have past 70-pound dumbbells. So again, like,
Yeah.
and that's of course pretty intuitive. Like, okay, now we just know some movements. We need to choose movements where you can move up in weight a bit. And then finally, like we mentioned already, we want it to be a movement that feels good for you. Like I could program you sissy squats, but I know it feels like shit for you personally. And like I always say, like you know your body better than me. So like if I've seen the movement and I don't have anything else to correct it, it still doesn't feel good for you, then like okay, cool, let's plug in a different movement. So as far as exercise selection goes, those are the main things that we're looking at. I think that again, like the rate limiter and the stimulus to fatigue of a movement are the biggest things. And range of motion really ties into stimulus to fatigue too. Like I know another thing we talked about is like, dude, why don't you push your squats lower? Like for me, one of the biggest, my ego took such a huge hit when I learned about this because the weight that I was squatting was literally cut in half. But for the longest time, I always thought that squats were a shitty movement for me. I never feel my quads. I can never get my legs to grow at all. But now all of a sudden, like, okay, I can actually do like an acid grass squat if I drop the weight significantly. And now I'm not near as tired after my squats. I'm not near as fatigued. My joints feel better. My CNS has less fatigue, but my quads are also smoked after my squat session because I'm actually taking that through the full range of motion. So another big realization for many people when we're talking about these concepts here is you are oftentimes by dropping the load, focusing on more range of motion, a slower eccentric. So basically, and I should also mention tempo. So basically, when we're talking about all these things, in most cases, it's smart to take 2 to 4 seconds on the eccentric. So 2 to 4 seconds on the lowering phase, we could say, and then to be explosive on the way up. We know explosive movement is going to recruit more fast twitch fibers, which have more ability to grow. Um, so when we're talking about all those things, again, like I'm going to reduce the weight, I'm going to increase my range of motion, I'm going to focus on this eccentric control and be explosive on the way up. You're going to get more stimulus, but again, less fatigue. Your joints are going to, you're using less load, so it's less hard on your joints, less overall fatigue for your nervous system. So again, for most people, like these concepts are a lot different. And again, it's really, we can really simplify it as basically like, hey, use good form and like probably do all these things you were initially taught to do, but kind of get away from in the sake of pushing for heavyweight anyways.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting just how much you can build muscle by dropping weight and doing it the right way. That was
Right?
a big one for me because everything is always like progressive overload, but in a way, it's like you could almost put range of motion or quality movement as a way to progress.
Absolutely, man. And that's the same thing for me. When I got super deep into learning about volume, and similarly, like progressive overload is the key to hypertrophy, I was so caught up in like, I'm just going to push heavy weight, right? Like, that's all that matters. Okay, my volume this week is more than my volume last week. But again, there's a volume, there's quality of volume as well. And if that's deteriorating across time as well, then you're not actually progressing.
Yeah. Well, you look at a sports example of this would be Tiger Woods. He won all those Masters with a swing that if he would have continued would have set him back. So he had to basically go to the drawing board on his swing, and he took a few steps back. But and I can't speak to everything because I'm not like his swing coach and a swing specialist. But that's an example where it's like if you want to do this for 30 years, which should be the goal, you got to drop down and make sure that you're building on a good foundation.
No, 100%, man. And I catch myself all the time, like every couple mesocycles, I have to, there's at least a couple movements where I'm like, fuck, I have been very much just focusing on like, okay, I'm gonna push the weight no matter what. And all of a sudden I've spent the last couple of weeks with like shitty form. I'm not getting very much stimulus out of this. I gotta drop the weight and basically focus on reworking this movement. And I think that's at least for me, I know for many clients as well, that's a relatively common thing where we kind of have to rework things like that. So that's the perfect example. But it's like you can keep going on as is, but you're not going to keep winning masters, right? You're not going to, and in our case, you're not going to keep building muscle. Eventually, like this lack of control and lack of form is going to catch up to you, and you're eventually going to have to rework this regardless.
Yeah, the best ability is availability, and if you're not available, you're not building shit.
Absolutely. So as far as exercise selection goes, do you have any other questions about that part?
No, no, I think that that was super helpful. I'd love to dive into the intensity, frequency, and volume aspect of this next, and just kind of like how people could have just like two or three takeaways from each to see a little bit more progress on their, you know, their goals.
Absolutely, and that ties in really well to kind of like the next bullet point we could say. So basically, this is like six keys to kind of like make up this system and how we're building it and progressing. So as far as intensity goes, how I like to do this is progress RIR across a mesocycle. So a mesocycle is basically, for most people, it's going to be a 4 to 6 week training block. Now, week one there, we're starting a good bit from failure. So we're starting most movements with 3 to 4 reps in reserve. Now, across the mesocycle, so across training weeks, we're going to decrease RIR or reps in reserve. So we're getting closer and closer and closer to failure. So week 2, maybe it's 3 RIR. Week 3, maybe it's 2 RIR. Week 4, maybe we're at 1 RIR. Week 5, we're at 0 to 1 RIR. We're really pushing you. Volume's going to be a little bit higher. And then week 6, we're going to be deloading, right? So I really like this process because one, I think it's a lot easier for most people to like progress intensity across a mesocycle as opposed to, okay, for the next 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to be training at like a 0 to 1 RIR, which I think is what a lot of people do. But also, a lot of people have like 2 productive training weeks a month, and then they're just absolutely so smashed from those 2 weeks that they like are either injured or just mentally they're not with it. They can't go in and push that hard every month. So I think for a lot of people, this sets them back more than it's actually productive to like always try to train so hard. Whereas we know that training with 3 reps left in the tank is still enough to stimulate muscle growth. And then over time, again, across the mesocycle, we're getting closer and closer and closer to failure. Now, this also really ties into our progression, which is one of the biggest things we focus on, is weekly progressing on a set by set basis. So, okay, last week you hit 185 for 8 on your back squat, and I'll typically assign clients a broader rep range like 8 to 12, 7 to 10, something like that, right? This week, since RIR decreases, I want you to push to add a rep or add a bit of load relative to this corresponding set last week. So again, like last week you hit 185 for 7 on your first set. This week you're gonna push for 185 for 8. Last week you hit 185 for 5 on your second set. This week I want you to push for 6. Or again, we can add a bit of load there where likely you're gonna like try not to dip below 5 reps if the goal is hypertrophy. But again, like for most people in our position, so people that have been training for more than a few years, it's super. You can go into the gym and do this same weight for the same reps over and over and over again, and it'll always feel hard because you're advanced to the point where you can lift heavy weight, right? And you can push yourself. But if we don't have this clear system for progression, you can just mindlessly like go in and like, yeah, that feels like about 1 rep left in the tank set, but never actually do more because it's always going to feel hard. So this progression system, like, hey, where were you last week? What were the specific numbers you hit? Okay, we're going to try to beat those this week. And your RIR progression ties into that. This very much gives people like, okay, what exactly do I need to do to improve from last week? So as far as the intensity goes, that's the biggest. And we could also look at it as intensity as load. But here I'm just going to and they kind of tie into each other as well. But here we're just going to look at it as proximity to failure. As far as volume, so I typically also like to adjust volume across the mesocycle.
Real quick, one other thing I wanted to just touch on is in the intensity piece that I feel like even I find myself running into that advanced lifters could run into is in a way like the mind can be a rate limiter where you're like, oh yeah, like that was 1 rep left, or like that was really hard. And I was squatting with my buddy that I used to play baseball with in college, and he back then he was much stronger than me, and he was lifting even bigger weights when he was playing pro ball. But I was like, damn, like he's watching me, like I'm going to almost failure each time, where I feel like it's easy to just go into like, all right, yeah, like that was good. I could maybe do one more. When in reality, it's almost like people would see more muscle growth if they worked out in front of someone they had a crush on, because they would actually get to failure every single time.
That's what hired me, bro.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I couldn't agree more, man. And that's that's the beauty of form videos too. And that's the beauty of, I would say, like the progression model. It pushes you to like keep adding a rep, keep adding a rep, keep adding a rep. So there's eventually going to come a point where like maybe week 1 you thought you were 3 hour, what was your 5 hour? What you thought was your 3 RIR was actually your 5 RIR. You actually had a lot more than you thought. But you're going to keep adding rep, keep adding rep. And that last week when it's 0 to 1 RIR on like everything that is safe to actually take to like failure. And again, we're not doing this that often. And I program it at 0 to 1. So like back squats, like I don't want you to actually fail in back squat, but I want you to push to the point where, yeah, you probably don't have another good rep left in the tank, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the beauty of this too, is like actually pushing it to that point. And honestly, that's why I like form videos a lot from clients too, is like it just holds people more accountable too, to like, am I really genuinely taking it there? And I know for me, even for like me personally, like my last week before the deload is always the week I record my form videos and send them to my coach, because it's accountability to me to like, fuck, I don't want to take this set of 10 to 15. Yeah, you get it. I don't want to take this set of 10 to 15 split squats to failure. But like, is it safe to fail on the movement? Yeah. Are we having you do that for 6 weeks in a row? Absolutely not. But I think mentally too, man, like you said, knowing like this is actually where my 0 RIR target is, and then being able to build off of that in the future is super important for most people.
Yeah, 100%. It's like just about anything in life. We put these like suppressor limiters on ourselves, and if we just were to like actually push to failure in so many different things, right? Even if it was like, how many hours could you work in a week? Like, should you work 100 hours? No, but do you have that in the tank? You might. You just don't know. You never get to that point.
No, I couldn't agree more, man. That's such a good analogy for like truly any area. I think business is probably the thing that sticks out the most. But just like you said, like, and that's, I don't know if you still do like 90-day outcomes and things like that, but I know like within our mentorship that we were a part of together for a long time, that's a big thing what we do. And it's very much like a sprint. Like, okay, I'm pushing myself in business harder than I ever had. But like your capacity, you have a lot larger capacity to do most things, I think, than we realize. But for most of us, we have to be pushed to that point, or like podcast is such a good example of that for me. Like these people that are on the show, and I'm sure you felt this, and I don't, you were pretty confident, dude. So I don't know if you have felt this way, but I know like for me, a lot of people I've had on the podcast, I'm like, fuck, like I literally don't know if I can hold a conversation with this person.
They're
But
just too
like they come
smart.
on, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm gonna sound like such a dumbass, but they come on, it's like, oh, cool, I did that. Now my capacity to communicate with people of that level of intelligence has just expanded, or like my knowledge of my capacity, I should say. So I
Yeah,
couldn't agree
totally.
more.
Dude, some of my early podcasts where I'm like, I like read the person's book and I'm just like asking questions on words I can't even pronounce. I was like, oh man, like get me out of here. It's so frightening. But eventually you realize that like, and sometimes it is dependent too on the person. Some people are super type A and just you're not going to connect with them. And that's honestly too though where to bring it into a sports analogy as a pitcher, some days you just don't have it. And you just got to gut it out, get 6 innings thrown, and keep your team in the ball game. And from a podcast standpoint, like yes, the idea is to throw a shutout and just absolutely crush. But I don't know. Now we're getting kind of off topic, but you
No,
grow. Basically, you grow. Push yourself up to like, holy shit, this is scary, and do that enough times, and you'll grow.
I couldn't agree more, man. And that's, I apologize. There's a leaf blower right below my window right now as well. So hopefully that's not too loud.
That's all
But
right.
I couldn't agree more. I saw one last note on this. I've been telling everybody around me about this because I thought it was super cool. Saw this diagram the other day. It was like similar to this. We're talking about imposter syndrome, basically. But it was like 3 overlapping circles, right? And you're like in the middle of it, and like everyone you look up to or everyone you think is so much smarter than you. I think you're realizing that like their knowledge is one of these circles off to the side, but like overlaps, like you see like their exclusive knowledge. But like if you're looking at like 3 people and you're in the middle of them, they have like this bubble of knowledge over here, this bubble of knowledge over here, this bubble of knowledge over here. So like you see like them in this very specialized area. They're like so much smarter than you. They're so much more talented than you. But then you have like all these other overlapping skills and knowledge that they don't have. To me, anyways, that's been a super cool way to like look at it.
Yeah.
If anyone else listening to this is a podcaster, that's been a very cool way to be like, okay, this is a very one specific specialized topic that I'm speaking to them about, but I don't have to feel like an idiot because I don't know as much about this one specific thing as they do.
Yeah, totally. Well, dude, honestly, and again, we're gonna tangent this a little bit, but anytime someone's getting into their own business or they're on social media and they're like, someone's already doing it, like literally every single person is a conglomerate of like 10,000 other circles. And like, that's what makes your circle individual. Like, that's what your DNA is.
Right.
And so to side tangent this, like, if anyone's like, oh, I don't know if I could do that, like, I'm not interesting enough, like, every single person that you've interacted with is a unique combination that makes you you. And so just by that fact, you're unique. And yeah, someone's going to know more than you, but then they're not going to know how to like read a book, and you can read a book. And so like there's always something that someone else sucks at, and you can't be great at everything. That's where it's like kind of like video games, I find, where it's like you got to kind of like pick what you're good at, and then you have
You're like,
teams
hey,
and people and friends that might be like totally better. Like my friend yesterday was a financial advisor, and we're working out. I'm just like, oh, like this guy's diving into a completely different world that I know like very small amount about, but he probably feels the same way about me in like the training space.
right, no, 100%, man.
That's why it's important to meet different people and get to know people with different outlooks and different perspectives.
Absolutely, dude. And we are way off from the hypertrophy
Yeah,
thing.
let's get back to the muscle building.
I would also say, truly, I think that's a value in connecting with people. Like, something that I've realized even in the last couple months is I always thought it was someone like, I'm good on my own. Like, I just like to kind of like work, do my own thing, create content. But truly, I know for me, I've just recently realized like hanging out with other like-minded people, not even like people that are the same as me, but just like spending time connecting with people. I don't know if it's just because of COVID, this has become so much stronger, like such a stronger realization for me, but like it's such a drastic contrast with like how much more confident I am, how much better I'm able to take myself to the world, and there's like my clarity and my goals and what I want. I feel like for whatever reason, just being around other people and like actually being vulnerable and open about shit like this it's to me almost a weird carryover to like, wow, I just like feel so much lighter, feel so much more confident, and again like clear on what I want. But again, way off here. So
Yeah,
some
we were going into volume, and then I said side quest. Let's go.
so volume across the course of a mesocycle. So typically we're going to start this a little bit lower. Um, Renaissance periodization has their volume landmarks, which we don't have to get too deep into here because that's like a whole other podcast in and of itself. But basically, at the start of the mesocycle, we're going to start most people around like their minimum effective volume. So this is like the minimum amount we know that they need to do to progress across the mesocycle. Across the mesocycle, we want to push to your maximum recoverable volume, so the absolute most you can do and still recover from, or even slightly beyond that. And for most people, we're going to go slightly beyond that because reality is like that last week before the deload, if it's someone that's eating a surplus like you are, I would rather err on the side of doing a little bit too much because, hey, we have a whole like deload week where you can recover, you can come back from it, and next mesocycle, you're going to feel a lot stronger. So typically then what we're looking at here is first I'm diving into like so like relative to last week's sets, how was their progress this week? Okay, so last week, like we saw solid, okay, like you squatted 185 for 765 last week. This week you squatted it for 9, 8, 7. Okay, cool. That's solid progress. We're likely okay to, and this isn't the only thing that we're going to adjust volume off of, but this is one of the major things we look at. Okay, we're seeing solid changes here. Whereas like, okay, maybe you only made progress on one of those sets. Okay, that's likely a good sign that we probably don't need to increase volume too much. If it stayed the same, we absolutely don't want to increase volume. If you're regressing, we likely need to decrease volume. Now, again, like consistently getting stronger, basically if we're looking at should we increase volume, keep volume the same, or decrease? If you're consistently getting stronger, pumps are good. You're consistently a little bit sore. None of these in and of themselves are like, hey, we're just chasing the pump or we're just chasing soreness. But again, like combined, they're all good signs to know if we should progress. So again, you're consistently progressing within these rep ranges. You're a little bit sore consistently. You're getting good pumps and you're not feeling run down. Okay, that's a good sign that we're right about at the right amount of volume. Now, again, like we can look, then from there, we're looking at, so like that's exactly, I know this mesocycle especially, which like the cool thing is the longer you work with someone, the more we can get dialed in on like about the amount of volume you seem to feel best with is. So like I know for this mesocycle, we've been dialed in on your volume demands, right? So those are the main things that we're looking at when we're adjusting volume across the mesocycle. And then again, like we get a good idea. For most people, and like if you listen to, I don't know how into like Renaissance periodization, like Mike Isertel and Eric Helms and Brian Miner have been having like the volume debate, right? Like should you keep your volume static or should you progress it? And like the example that they use is like you go from 10 hard sets to 20 hard sets of a movement across a mesocycle or a movement or per muscle group, which honestly is like, as you know, it's like, hey, maybe across this mesocycle we've gone from three hard sets with this movement to 4 to 5 hard sets, right? So we're never like ramping it up too drastically, but we are increasing it over time. And then across multiple mesocycles as well. And then you can stop me anytime if you would like. But so that's kind of how we're progressing across the mesocycle. We're deloading, starting the process over. Now, across multiple mesocycles, your body's an adaptation machine, right? The more you hit it with the same stressor, the more it adapts to that, the less you get out of it. So over time, our volume demands are going to increase in order to keep seeing growth. So if I had you doing the exact same, like following the exact same sets, reps as you were your first meso, you wouldn't get as much out of it. So what I like to do is across 3 to 4 mesocycles, we're going to layer on volume a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Now, typically we'll, like the most common definition of volume is going to be number of hard sets. That said, for most people, there's a very hard ceiling for like within my time constraints, this is the amount of volume I can do, right? So I think it makes more sense to, in this situation, look at it as sets times reps times weight. So basically here, over mesocycles, we're slightly increasing in rep ranges. And this is also the thinking behind, like, I know you probably noticed we've implemented a lot more downsets. And I don't think you even saw your my response to your check-in yet, but like this coming mesocycle, again, we're going to implement a lot more downsets. So basically what we're doing there, a downset is basically like, yo, I want you to drop the weight by 10 to 15% and hit the same RIR target. So we know that that's going to count to, that's basically going to come out to, so like you might do like 2 sets of back squat at 7 to 10 to RIR. That's going to be followed by 2 down sets where you're going to decrease the load by 10% and then just rep it out till you hit your RIR target. So again, like volume there would be slightly higher than if I had just prescribed you 4 sets of 7 to 10, right? So just by implementing things like that across mesocycles, we're increasing volume. Again, your next mesocycle, we're going to have more downsets than we did this one. And also rep ranges on accessory work will likely be slightly higher. And then the final mesocycle will take you through like some type of metabolite phase. So here we're actually implementing a lot of intensification techniques. So lots of like supersets. So for example, I might have you do like a dumbbell chest fly, supersetable push-ups to failure. Things like that, right? Like more like finisher type things. But again, we're jacking up the volume more and more. Now, from there, we can only continue to do this for so long again before it's just not scalable anymore. So what we do from there, then we'll take people through a lower volume phase. So this will be like a strength phase. So by this point, again, volume's pretty damn high. We just can't keep adding more. So we essentially want to, quote unquote, resensitize your body to volume. So a strength phase is essentially, we're going to drop our rep ranges way down. We're mostly going to focus on compound movements and anywhere from like 4 to 10 reps most of the time. Overall volume is a lot lower. But again, by the time we've gone through that, we're doing more than enough to maintain muscle. And really, like the goal here isn't to make gains. For some people, it's fun to focus on like, hey, I'm just getting a lot stronger, because the reality is you will hit a lot of PRs because you're just working on lower rep ranges. But the number one outcome is we're doing enough to hold on to the muscle that you have. And when we go back to a higher volume style of training like you were following before, you're going to be resensitized to it. So once again, you'll get more gains out of doing less volume.
Yeah, totally. So it's just going into minimum effective volume to maintain the muscle that you've built until you can, in a way, from like a nutritional standpoint, you're just resensitizing and getting back to like balanced position so that you can now, with the new adaptation you've created, go into something a little bit harder.
Exactly. It's kind of like in space.
One question I have on that love to dive into a little bit more is just how focusing on upper body or lower body is more beneficial than doing a total body split. Maybe it's like 3 days and you're doing total body, you're doing upper body, lower body, total body. Just because some of the stuff I've read is, and if you think about it, maybe logically, it's like if I'm spending an entire day just hammering the quads, like by the end of the day, like my quads and the other leg muscles like are going to be toast. Versus if I'm going and jumping back before like upper body compound, lower body compound, upper body compound, lower body compound. Yeah, you're getting hard sets on there over the course of the week, but there's not like that compounding effect throughout the course of the day. Is that kind of how it works? And you only have, some people only have so much time to train, so total body does make sense, right? Availability is paramount over all of the stuff we're talking about. But how do you balance that if you are doing a total body split?
So typically how I look at it, frequency, volume, and intensity are kind of on a sliding scale. Or we could say like as 2 factors increase, one of them has to decrease. Like we can't have a high frequency, high volume, high intensity program because people are just going to be smashed. So like your number one goal is to get jacked right now, right? Like you're turning into Thor / Captain America, but like a more handsome version of both those guys.
Exactly. And taller, even though I'm not 6'4".
But so we know that volume is going to be paramount here, right? Like volume is the factor that we want to push the most. And it doesn't intensity relative to like, again, here we talk like, is it load or is it like actually how close we're getting to failure? But here I'm going to talk about like how close we're getting to failure. It's going to be relative, like I would say moderate. But that means like if we have high volume, our frequency is pretty high, it just wouldn't make sense for us to also have, we have high volume and our intensity is pretty high. It wouldn't make sense for us to also have frequency pretty high because we're just going to be smashed. Whereas like if you were like, hey, I can only train 3 days per week. So very much for most people, when we're determining that, it just comes down to how frequently you train. Because like you said, if I can only train 3 days per week, the reality is we just can't fit that much volume into 3 days per week training. So your frequency, you're touching everything 3 times a week, and which is relatively high, and your intensity just have to be high in order for you to make gains. But again, the more we increase any one of these factors, the more we have to decrease like other factors. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas like we can also do like, so for example, right now you're training 5 days per week. You're following upper, lower, upper, lower, upper split, right? If we wanted, just because I know you want a little bit more focus on your upper body. Whereas like if you were like, I just want to build some cakes, just some big old glutes, right? Like we'd probably switch that lower, upper, lower, upper, lower. But like past that point, most people anecdotally I found, even if we get into like, okay, if you're training 6 days a week and we're training upper, lower, upper, lower, upper, lower, most people, even from that, it's just so much frequency that most people are smashed. Whereas like a push, pull, lower tends to, like, from a recovery standpoint, seems to work better for most people. And again, a lot of that is even just like anecdote from my own experiences with clients. But if we're looking at like a full body style of training, and even if it's not so much like your central nervous system, just mentally for most people, like I know I don't want to train legs 6 days a week, right? So if we're having to train full body 6 times per week, just the mental fatigue, which again is another thing actually I talked about in your check-in. So I'm sorry for you to dive into that. But we also have to consider like the mental fatigue of a movement or a training session is actually a big part of the process. And like it does take a recovery toll as well. So like one thing I mentioned for you is like we're likely going to sub in a different movement for your split squats this next training phase. Because I know like for me, like after a couple of mesocycles and I'm getting really, really strong on split squats, the mental toll of just like, fuck, like I got split squats this session. Okay, like got to get myself revved up for them. And then like 3 to 5 minutes between, like, okay, just got to get my mind right for this next set. Like that in itself is a large fatigue cost. Whereas if I could hop on the leg press, I could get the same amount of quad stimulus out of this. Now, and again, like for you with the equipment available, we're not able to plug in the leg press, but you get the idea. Then it makes sense a lot of times to like, how can we make this a little bit less mentally fatiguing as well? Which is where another part of their frequency standpoint, like most people just don't want to train like upper body that much. Whereas like on the flip side, like I know something we've done with your program, some is like, hey, at the end of this, we're going to like add a little, at the end of your lower body day, we're going to add some lateral raises so you can get a delt pump as well, right? For most people, again, like you mentioned, the best availability is availability. That's the saying, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, and it kind of ties back to overall like adherence. And part of that too is not just like these science-based principles, but how can we make this really, really fun for you so you love your training program? Because I know that if you love your training program, you're having fun with this, you'll be super consistent with it and you will get great results out of it. So I think that like so many different factors, but as far as frequency goes, like those are the biggest things we want to consider.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Slightly off topic, but you hear people talk about decision fatigue, right? And just like how much effort it takes to be like, I'm wearing this, I'm eating this, I'm buying this. And so you want to systemize that as much as possible because it does take energy, right? And so this weekend was a great example. I was like, man, I feel like I'm just getting smoked like every single time. Like imagine if every day you had to wake up and like amp yourself up to go to work. And like that happens all the time and people get absolutely drained.
Right.
As opposed to where if like every day you're like, oh man, I can't wait to go to work. Like this is, or you don't even have to be like that, but just not like hating it so much. Like that takes energy, right? I love to say like emotions are energy in motion. So the more you have to like change how you feel about what you're about to go and do, like that's going to take energy to address that. And so the more you can just have it like be super smooth going into whatever it is, whatever lift you're doing, the more energy you're going to have for that. At least that's how I look at it.
No, I couldn't agree more, man. And I think this is one of the hardest things to draw the line with. Like sometimes we just have to do hard shit, right? Like similar to the podcast. Like I know if I'm going into a podcast with someone that's like we mentioned, like so smart, at like the 5 minutes before that, it's like, yeah, I just don't want to do this right now. But I know this is what I need to do. So there is a fine line between like we can't just avoid everything that's hard, of course.
Totally. Yeah.
But which I think is very much like as a coach, you have to understand where that line is And you have to be honestly, like, I think as a client or as someone that's coaching yourself, you have to just ask yourself, like, am I just rationalizing to take it easier on myself right now? Or could I do something else that would have less mental fatigue but would give me the same results?
Yeah, that's one I always find interesting is everyone like initially it's like everyone's like just move your body, like go exercise, go move, and then it's like all right, find something you enjoy doing, and then there does come a point where it's like all right, it's like I don't enjoy taking my cat's litter out, but I gotta fucking do it, right?
Right.
And it's like there's a lot of things in life like I don't want to pay my taxes, but I gotta do it, and you can't be so like oh only work out if you like enjoy the workout. Like sometimes it just sucks. Every single day I get clients and I'm just like all right, split squats, let's get the legs up on the bench, and like oh these again. I'm like yeah these again. It's like you're gonna hate some things, but you just gotta do it.
Yeah. And that's part of it too, is like keeping the, I would say look at that from the frame of, okay, is the decision I'm making, does this still want align with the outcomes that I want long term? Right. I think that's the best with like the exercise selection thing. If you're like looking to swap a movement, I think that's the best way you could frame it. Because similarly, like, and you'll feel this too when you get in the metabolite phase, dude, because it's pretty intense, man. And by the last week where it's 0 to 1 RAR, it's like, damn, I don't know if I want to go into the gym this week. And I was just talking to another client about this morning. Like, for some people who their goals are just like, hey, I want to feel good, I want to move well, I don't care about like taking my physique to a crazy level. Okay, we probably wouldn't implement that intensive of a metabolite phase because it's not necessary to like that extent. It would burn them out more than anything. But like for you, or I know like for me, this was just a couple weeks ago into the same thing. I was like, this is the hardest week of training I've ever had. Do I want to be in the gym? Not really this week because this shit sucks. Like I'm exhausted. But I know long term that's what I want. So that's another important thing to play.
Yeah, for sure. Where are we at on your 6 keys to building muscle?
Let's see. We had consistent start and endpoints, exercise selection, RIR progression, stimulus to fatigue ratio, volume across the mesocycle, and volume across multiple mesocycles. So we actually hit it all.
We hit it all. Great. I mean, that's like I said at the very beginning of this podcast. It's like you get your training, you get your nutrition, you got your recovery. This is good. This could be a whole nother topic just on like how you fuel this from a nutrition standpoint. So we'll definitely dive into that at some other time. And then recovery is the one that's like most overlooked. I was talking with a client on it today. He's like, "Yeah, I just haven't been really sleeping well." And I'm like, "Dude, that's like so important if we want to get
Yeah.
everything building as much as we can because we're in that phase with him." Um, but dude, thank you so much for coming on, and I'm super excited to continue to grow in this personally. And then I appreciate you just coming in and sharing your knowledge for everyone on how they can get jacked for 2021.
Dude, it's been my pleasure. It's been super fun to watch all your progress, especially. No, man, I couldn't be happier to be here.
Yep, cool, man. All right, we'll take it easy. Boom. So there you have it. Obviously, a lot of science going into that one, a lot of things that you can apply to the stuff that you're doing in the gym. And just want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to today's episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, be sure and share it. Leave a review, leave a rating. And just want to reiterate the direction of this podcast. We're not going to get away from mental health by any means, not going to get away from mental performance and having on super inspiring people, authors, experts, all the different people that we've had on the podcast. But what I want you to be able to take away from each episode is something that you can use to train your mind to level up or train your body to level up, right? We want to create the life of our dreams. We want to create the body of our dreams. The body is the path to power, right? And so having on a guest like Jeremiah is going to help us do that. If we're able to create the body of our dreams and apply all the lessons we learn in the gym, working out and really pushing ourselves physically and mentally, well, now we can apply that to literally anything in life. You think you can only do so much with a certain weight. Well, now you can go in and say, well, I said that in the gym. Now there's going to be something in life. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a career where you're saying, I don't know if I can do this, but you have proof. You have evidence that you've been able to come over that hurdle. And that's what I want to help you guys create. So hope you guys enjoyed the episode, like I said, and I'll catch you guys next time on the Down Dog Athletics Podcast.